Okay, hello, welcome. Welcome, Mark, and for anyone who might be viewing at a later date on the recording. My name is Jill Foster. I'm Regional Director of Catholic Social Action for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Andrew Musgrave, and I am the director of the Catholic Social Action Office, and I'm in the city of Cincinnati.
And Aaron?
Hi, Erin Shaw, just regular layperson who is involved with the Catholic Labor Network and various labor organizing within Dayton and Cincinnati.
Great, thank you. And we're so happy to have Erin with us as she's giving, this is seminar number 2 of her Faith and Labor series. And so we're happy to have you all with us. And we're going to go ahead and open up in prayer, which is the prayer that we used last time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I think Andrew, you and I can bounce back and forth on the verses or the prayer, if that's all right. So if everyone wants to take a moment to allow for the Holy Spirit to come into our lives and acknowledge its presence with us. We'll begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glorious Saint Joseph, you are the patron of all who labor and a model of quiet strength. I ask for your guidance as I begin my work today. Help me to see my daily tasks not just as a burden or a means to an end, but as a sacred invitation to participate in God's ongoing creation.
Grant me the wisdom to work with a clear mind and a focused heart. Help me to develop the unique talents I have received, using them not for my own vanity, but for the benefit of my community and the service of the greater good. May I approach every challenge with patience and every success with gratitude.
Grant me the humility to work with integrity, especially when no one is watching. Teach me to value the dignity of every person I encounter, colleagues, clients, and competitors alike. Help me to place the needs of others above my own ambitions and to find joy in being a silent builder of a more just and peaceful world.
Grant me the spirit of service to offer my energy and my efforts for those who cannot work, for those who are unfairly treated, and for the families who depend on me. May I work with a mindfulness towards creation, caring for our common home through the choices I make in my profession.
All for the glory of God, following your example of humble labor and faithful presence. May my work today be a prayer in action, and may I return home tonight with a heart at peace. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Once again, welcome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please, if you have any questions during this presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. You can ask in the chat or you can unmute yourself as well if you'd like to ask. But for now, I'm going to unpin myself and Andrew and share the presentation, and Aaron will take it away.
All right.
All right, let me pull up the presentation for you.
Think maybe it might be a good thing that we had some issues, some technical difficulties, and not everybody can be here, and this might be recorded because some of this stuff is a little bit it's super timely, but it is something that kind of creates a lot of discomfort for a lot of people. And I think Lent is a good time for this and having this reflection and this self-reflection. So if you want to go ahead and go to the first slide. So the dignity of work. Catholic social teaching holds that an economy should serve all people rather than forcing people to serve an economy. And so that's essentially the entire premise of what Catholic social teaching is when it comes to the dignity of work is that it looks at all people as unique individuals, and the goal is to try and find a place for everyone to create a better society overall, rather than forcing people to work for an economy that only benefits a small few people. Um, all workers, those unable to work and unemployed who are looking for work, are created in the image of God and deserve access to wages and safe workplaces that honor the human dignity while also providing an opportunity for rest. I think when it comes to Catholic social teachings, a lot of this is very philosophical, and it has been. I'll talk about it later throughout the presentation. Is that when we're talking about things like minimum wage and living wage, a lot of this has to do with people's different perspectives. And so this is why it's really, really important for people to be engaging in dialogue as far as what does it actually mean to grant people the human dignity in their work. Um, what does it mean as far as what's a reasonable living wage, which varies from area to area, and what constitutes rest, what constitutes giving people an ability to have a moderate, a very humble life, but still being able to do things like accumulate savings and make sure that they're trying to prepare for emergencies. Um, since Rerum Novarum in 1891, the church has upheld that workers have the right to formation of labor organizing in the workplace to ensure their human dignity is honored. So before 1891, the church didn't have any official real social teachings. And during the Industrial Revolution, which is when Rerum Novarum was released, this was a point in time where we even saw a lot of clergy members and people within especially immigrant communities that were starting to try and get involved in labor organizing, because we had multiple different demographics of people who existed within the church. You had immigrants who were Catholics, and I think a lot of people kind of forget that part of Catholic history, that a good portion of Catholics throughout the United States, and again, this isn't just United States history, it's Catholic global history. But in places that are relevant to us in the United States, you had Italian Catholics, you had Irish Catholics, you had all different types of Catholic immigrants that were coming to the United States and that were seen as less than because of their immigration status. And so again, the church was seeing this on a global perspective. So because of a lot of the conflict that was happening between workers and between business owners, especially in the 1890s, there were a lot of clergy and lay people that were involved in labor organizing and union organizing. And without an official church stance, a lot of them were being accused of socialism or communism. And so in 1891, when Rerum Novarum was released, it gave people an opportunity to acknowledge that the church had a clear stance on what the dignity of work in an increasingly modernized society was going to look like. If you want to go to the next slide. So, economic theories and Catholic social teachings. This is one that I could probably blow all of the time that we have on, because economic theories are theories. And we've got capitalism, socialism, communism that were created in the late 1700s, 1800s, like early 1900s. They have evolved and changed. And a lot of people really haven't studied economic history to understand not just the theories that they are based around, but also the times that they were based around, and seeing the people who were the philosophers that came up with the economic theories, what their life was like. So in the late 1700s, in the 18th century, you've got Adam Smith, who was a philosopher, and Adam Smith is widely recognized as the father of modern economics and the father of capitalism. And capitalism, in theory, was supposed to be a more just economic theory that was supposed to eliminate the wealth inequality and income inequality and status inequality that feudalism had created. So, Adam Smith, as a philosopher, was very focused on morality when it came to economics. He was very focused on fairness. We've got the wealth of nations is what really capitalism is based on, as well as theory of moral sentiments. And then we had some notes from lectures that he did on jurisprudence. So he, as an economist and as a philosopher, was very focused on trying to ensure that everything is just and fair within an economy. So what happens, and I like to talk about this when I'm talking about economic theories, is what happened is that then you have the economic theories that lose their understanding, or time and societies evolve past that economic theory, and it needs reframing, or it needs updating, and it needs reworking. And so when when capitalism started to stray away from a moral economic system, excuse me, I apologize. When capitalism started to stray away from that, what we had was a great deal of income inequality and wealth inequality, because you had these periods of time where there were technological advances and industrialization, and a lot of the capital that these businesses that were running the economy was owned by a select handful of people. So when that happened, a lot of the workers were wages were stagnated. They were not having workers' rights. These workers who were still showing up and they were doing jobs were seeing less than living wages, and the people who were employing them were not interested in seeing their human dignity. And so this is the time period when you start to see, communist theory, because Karl Marx was an impoverished worker. He was someone who was working in poverty, and a lot of here's where I get a little bit dicey when I talk about this. Is a lot of people don't see that perspective from Karl Marx. They're not understanding where exactly it is that communism comes from, because communism not only is built in workers' rights movements, and it is essentially what is supposed to be this utopia on earth where there is no class, there are no classes, there is no money. It's a moneyless, classless state where everybody kind of like operates in harmony and carries their own weight and works together, but it is a removal of God. So it's based in atheism. And a lot of people, including the church denounces communism because of atheism. But the thing that I feel like, especially, I alluded to the fact that this is coinciding with Lent. And one of the things that I have found very kind of interesting as far as a parallel goes is that a lot of Karl Marx's criticisms as far as religion go, he calls it the opium of the people, and essentially acknowledges that there is an ability for religion and organized religion to, for a lack of better term, or for lack of better wording, it gives people a reason to phone in their morality and kind of replace it with just worshiping God rather than living out faith. And in my own personal opinion, it seems parallel to kind of the criticism that Jesus has of the religious hypocrites, where he gives us the seven woes. And a lot of people think that that is just based in, Judaism, but in reality, it's any religion is capable of it. Any organized religion, once there is kind of a loss of self-awareness and a lack of self-awareness and this motivation to be materialistic, and the way Jesus criticizes the religious hypocrites of the time is, there is a want to live in luxury and in self-indulgence, and bear heavy burdens on people without lifting a finger to help them. And kind of being materialistic. So I just think that it's interesting that when you're going through and looking at the history of communism, we as Christians and as Catholics have a tendency to denounce the godlessness of atheism without asking, or of communism, but without asking why. And I'll talk about that in some later slides. And then socialism. So the church's criticisms of all of these economic systems exist. There is no subscription to any particular economic theory. They criticize the economic totalitarianism that can stem from capitalism, which is essentially what we're seeing, where wealthy business people are able to control the economy and reduce people to just beings that are being profited, but we lose our human dignity. They criticize socialism, and they criticize socialism as eliminating people's ability to own businesses and have an ability to economically advance in that way. And then obviously the criticism of communism is that there is a removal of God, and there is a removal of ownership of private property. So I've argued with communists when it comes to communist theory about how we protect people's personal privacy without having like actual private property. And it's been interesting conversations, but we haven't figured out a solution to that yet. So next slide. So the historical conflict between the systems and the religion. This is something that, again, I find really interesting. I like to see the parallels in history, and this is why I feel like this is really, really timely. This conversation is really timely. Is I put, and I apologize because it's a little bit difficult for me to read this because it's smaller print on here, but when you look throughout history, one of the things that I was speaking with. I believe he's a professor now, but we were talking about Spain. We were talking about the Spanish Civil War, and then segueing into Francisco Franco's Spain, which Catholics were heavily involved in. And during the New Deal time, there was kind of this global rise in fascism, and there was also a global rise in communism. And so you have these two extreme economic theories, where fascism, if you look into Mussolini's Italy, it was a corporatist state. It was where the companies owned everything. So you had these two extremes. But when we were seeing these rise in different economic theories and people really subscribing to those, and then that creating a conflict between a lot of different people, Monsignor John Ryan had quoted Reverend Wilfred Parsons in regards to Spain. And he said that the great tragedy of Spain was that in the 19th century, the working masses apostatized from the church, as Pope Pius X once remarked. And it is well to remember it was poverty, destitution, and injustice which made them apostatize. They got to hate the church because they hated the friends of the church who exploited them and whom the church did nothing to rebuke or correct. The words of Pope Leo XIII 45 years ago went unheeded, and his great encyclical Rerum Novarum was neglected. The lesson for all of us is that we should meet the evil of communism not merely by denouncing it, not by stigmatizing not by stigmatizing as communistic all fundamental reforms. We must attack the main causes of communism. Among those, poverty, insecurity, and inequitable distribution of wealth and income. Failure to remove these evils will do more to strengthen communism than all the propaganda and boring in movements of the organized communist movement. So I think that this is a really important and timely quote, even though it's uncomfortable. I think that, again, especially during Lent, I think there's no better time for us as Catholics to take a step back and remember our history, because this right here, we're seeing this really repeat itself. So if you want to go to the next slide. This is another historical quote from the United States. It is also Monsignor John Ryan. And during this time, a lot of people, this is a fun fact, a lot of people don't really know that during the Roosevelt administration, when the New Deal was being enacted, with which Catholics were heavily involved with helping create and champion for the New Deal, there was also something that was going on with a lot of corporate Wall Street bankers called the Wall Street Putsch. And this was essentially where Wall Street bankers were trying to overthrow Roosevelt, and they were caught. I can't remember exactly who it was. It was I want to say it was a retired military general that someone had told about this because they wanted to involve him in it. And he, I believe, had become disillusioned during a war and had essentially said, the people, like the exploited workers, essentially deserved better. He believed that it was un-American, and so he exposed the Wall Street Putsch. And one of the fundamental people, one of the integral people who was involved in trying to overthrow FDR was actually Prescott Bush, who is the father of George H.W. Bush. George W. Bush and the grandfather of George H.W. Bush. So interesting. I thought was interesting. But so this is when FDR was trying to FDR was trying to put in the New Deal, and Catholics were heavily involved in it. And Monsignor John Ryan had made a speech on October the 8th of 1936. And in this speech, he said, "The assertion that President Roosevelt is closely associated with or supported by prominent communists is utterly without foundation, as is the charge that he is a communist himself. Both accusations are ugly, cowardly, and flagrant calumnies." And I think I'm mispronouncing that. I'm not 100% sure. "They're violations of the Eighth Commandment. Today in America, as in every other great industrial country, the opponents of necessary and just legislation for the weaker economic classes endeavor to discredit these measures by fastening upon them labels which frighten the timid, the ignorant, and the uncritical. It is a very ancient, but in the long run, a very stupid device." And I feel a little bit I feel a little bit not right just saying, hurling insults. But I think this is a really, again, super timely, super important, because we're seeing a lot of people who are calling for legislative reforms, who are calling for labor organizing. We are seeing them be accused as communists or socialists, regardless of their religious affiliation. And I think it's really important, especially for us as Catholics, to be able to use our discernment and help other people, when we understand this, use their discernment to understand, we can't just hurl these accusations out or allow accusations that are coming from Catholics and other Christians that accuse people who want just legislation of being like godless communists. And it is a violation of the eighth commandment. So I just thought these were really important. History doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So if we want to go to the next slide. The demand for a living wage. So again, this is where philosophy gets, a lot of people will try and debate different things when it comes to a living wage. And around the Great Depression was really when FDR started talking about a living wage. And it was when Monsignor John Ryan, who had helped create the New Deal and had been working on that project since, I want to say, 1919, when he started the bishops' conference. In regards to that, the living wage in Catholic social teaching, it's defined as a wage sufficient enough to provide families reasonable comfort and dignity. So this is really hard. There's a lot of people want to look at different jobs and see some jobs as less than deserving an ability to be able to gain a living wage, or to be able to have rest, or to be able to accumulate a savings. And Catholic social teaching really holds that it doesn't matter whether somebody is a janitor or whether somebody is, a teacher, or when someone has a job that gives them an opportunity to help contribute to society, that as Catholics, it's our responsibility to uphold that there is dignity in that, and they do deserve compensation that gives them human dignity, but also just the acknowledgement that what they do matters. Defining a living wage has philosophical thinking, so that's pretty much what I've already covered. Minimum wage versus a living wage. Ideally, when it comes to Catholic social teachings, those should match. A minimum wage should match a living wage. And there are a lot of people who will say, you know, a minimum wage is just for kids that are just entering the workforce. And, you know, they shouldn't be able to go out and have the same type of wages that somebody who has kids and is in their mid 20s should have. And a minimum wage is designed for someone who works a full, at this point in time, 40-hour work week to be able to go in for 40 hours. And that 40 hours should give them an opportunity to be able to have a decent life. When it comes to young adults, people who are still in high school, if they are not working that full 40 hours, then they should be able to still obtain a living wage at an hourly rate, and they should be getting a fraction of what it would cost. So that's how, you know, you would have a 16-year-old be able to buy a car or be able to save for college or save for their first apartment, is if they're only working a reasonable amount of hours because they're still in school, they should be able to accumulate enough of a savings to be able to give them a head start. So again, that argument that a living wage or a minimum wage is only for people who are younger, it doesn't really hold up when you kind of do the math. Um, Now, a lot of people also don't understand how legislation is enacted in living wage or in minimum wages, but also how much of our legislation is actually written by companies, by corporate lobbying. So, our minimum wage for a very long time has been stagnant because a lot of corporations and unfortunately with the help of smaller business associations, they have lobbied against wage increases. So the thinking behind this was that, you know, larger corporations were able to benefit off of smaller corporations being able to say, in order for us to be able to be competitive with larger or stay competitive with larger companies, we need to keep wages low because otherwise we would not be able to afford to pay for workers, and then we would essentially go out of business. In reality, looking back on it, what we should have been looking at was antitrust and anti-monopoly legislation. That was a pretty good indicator that larger companies who were able to really outpay smaller companies, there we should have found a different way to be able to make that competition be able to happen rather than making the workforce pay for that. So unfortunately, hindsight is 2020, and we are at a point where a lot of people are not able to obtain a living wage. If you want to go to the next slide. The evolution of Catholic labor teachings. Again, this has been reaffirmed multiple times. And I think it's really important for us as Catholics, especially to understand. And once again, looking back on the fact that we are in another historical cycle where we're seeing a lot of accusations of communists as being godless savages, which in my experience has not been the case. I've known a lot of people who identified as communists, and they had a good moral compass. They just viewed things differently. They spoke differently. And so I kind of have a hard time. I have a hard time with reconciling the use of communism and socialism as an insult, because it also feels like we're violating the human dignity of people who have a very real lived experience. Just my opinion. So, um, Rerum Novarum 1891, when the Catholic Church becomes pro-union and becomes pro-labor, but also encourages people to be involved in dialogue. I think this is the biggest part of what has created a lot of the disconnect, is that as consumers, as business owners, as people who are involved in the economy in our own special way, it is Catholic social teaching has always solidified that it's our responsibility to be involved and continue creating dialogue and being a part of that dialogue. So Quadragesimo Anno in 1931. This is during the Great Depression. So you had 1891 when Rerum Novarum was released, and then you had 40 years later, Quadragesimo Anno, and that solidified yet again the same thing, that the church upholds that there is dignity in lower income jobs, lower income workers, and that as Catholics, it is our responsibility to make sure that we don't get distracted by the temptations of economic advancement. And again, you know, from biblical quotes of living our lives in luxury and self-indulgence, and being tempted that trying to meet more than just our basic needs is the goal, and forget that some people don't have the ability to meet their basic needs. And so that was the second solidification of that. Labrum Externs in 1981. This was Pope St. John Paul II. And it was really important for that part of labor history, because Pope St. John Paul II was very integral in, I think I'm pronouncing that right. I might be messing it up. Just also for everyone, I did have a brain bleed a couple of weeks ago. And so maybe 3 weeks ago. So my speech is a little bit wonky, but so these are harder. These are harder than regular English words. So in 1981, during the, I guess, the Cold War, you still had Soviet Russia, and Poland was a very important part in trying to defeat the communists. And so during that time, that was one of the reasons that Pope St. John Paul II, who was the first non-Italian pope in 455 years, was elected. It was because that gave the Polish people an opportunity to actually fight for fair wages and democracy, because economics, human rights, and democracy are so closely intertwined that it was Catholic social teachings and the Polish Solidarity movement that solidified that workers have a right to their own economic autonomy, and they have a right to participate in the economy. And that is what helped defeat Soviet Russia. I mean, it took 10 years. It took roughly about 10 years, but that was such a huge part of it. Based on the way that I've been pronouncing things, I'm not even going to try. I tried it last night and I felt like I was fine, but today it's not doing great. So this was Charity and Truth in 2009. And this was Pope Benedict. For a second, it escaped my mind. Again, solidified yet again. So this is well over 100 years of the church solidifying that economics cannot be separated from morality, that we all have an obligation within our everyday lives to really pay attention and come back to what is important, and that is the human dignity of everybody within the economy. And this one is where we really start to get into social justice, especially as the world became globalized, as we started to see greater income inequality, not just in between first and third world nations, but also within first world nations. We saw more greater income inequality. So this is really where there is continued stress coming from the church that it is not just about money. It's about the dignity of all of the workers, and it's about solidarity and participating in making sure that everyone that touches our supply chains has human dignity in their work. So if you want to go to the next slide. Real world examples. This is kind of my favorite. Is I love talking about the historical issues, the historical backing of labor organizing and why it's so important. 1980s, again, the Polish Solidarity movement. This really helped the Catholic Church be able to bring the gospel to life. It helped the Catholic Church be able to help workers who were suffering from, again, in that time period, it was the, communist regime. So we've got totalitarianism that's on both sides of the political spectrum. This was the very left political spectrum, where a certain amount of people were able to seize power, and they were able to concentrate that power and abuse it for themselves, which ended in economic inequality for a lot of people and a loss of autonomy over their own lives and over their own work. So the Catholic Church helped put in motion the the labor movement that, again, they were coming from fully a fully communist or authoritarian regime, and they were able to restore democracy with the help of the Catholic Church. And what the Catholic Church did was they helped post bail for workers who were arrested. They helped people have aid during martial law. They helped make sure that information was being passed. They helped educate people. So the Catholic Church as a network, because I want to say that the population of Poland was roughly about 90% Catholic at that point in time. So even though you had a communist government, you had a good portion of people who were Catholics. And so that network of churches was able to help not just, give aid, but also create community, which is really, really important in times like these. Coors Brewing. The Coors Brewing strikes is strikes and boycotts were really, really big in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And Coors Brewing actually they're still pretty infamous for, labor violations. Now, one of the important things that's happening historically right now is that we are seeing a lot of legislation that the Catholic Church has been denouncing and that a lot of different faith leaders have been denouncing as totalitarianism. And that is also the business class that is having too much power over our economy, wealthier business people who have too much power over our economy. A lot of this legislation actually started in the 1980s with a group called the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation was started by three men, one of whom was Joe Coors. And Joe Coors, along with Ed Fuellner and Paul Weyrich, I believe are the three men. So Joe Coors had this history of discrimination against workers and against business people that he could have done business with, but because of discriminatory practices, he chose to help stifle a lot of businesses. But also there were documents or accounts of LGBTQIA members being put under lie detector tests. Sorry, a little bit of a brain fart again. They were having to go through lie detector tests. So the human dignity of a lot of different demographics of people, whether they were Black Americans, whether they were immigrants, whether they were Indigenous people, LGBTQIA members, Coors Brewing had a pretty bad reputation for that. And so there were a series of very coordinated economic strikes and boycotts against Coors Brewing for a very long time. And then as people were getting more and more rights, as the government was giving more and more people human dignity when it came to protections against discrimination in their workplaces, people like Joe Coors saw that as an attack on their freedom in business. So they believe that as business owners, they should have the right to discriminate against whoever they want because their business, if they only want certain demographics of people to be able to work with them and to be able to make money, they believe they should be allowed to discriminate against those demographics of people. So as those people were getting more and more protections, Joe Cors's answer to that was to get involved in the government to be able to try and dismantle those protections and create a free market, essentially, that would allow more discriminatory practices if business owners wanted that. So now, as far as what labor unions are able to do, I think it's really important that a lot of people understand that a lot of private policies, there's nuance when it comes to private policies, that we can have private policies that are proprietary for a business and they need to be protected because the business would not be able to be special or unique. But there's also business policies that are harmful, and there's public policy, or there's, public safety that's being put at risk. So when it comes to working with labor organizations or with union members, a big part of that is helping protect whistleblowers. And a lot of people don't talk about or understand that there are a lot of really good employees who have public safety and public interest at the forefront of how they want to do their job. And because of the threat of retaliation, the threat of losing their job, a lot of the time they're not able to do that. So a very good example, we're in Ohio, is East Palestine, was the Norfolk Southern train derailment. And that train derailment and how that happened, that there were a lot of safety violations. There were union employees, and there were employees who had been trying to draw attention in the years or months leading up to this, that they believed that the trains that were transporting through cities where this could happen to any of us, that they were carrying toxic chemicals, but they were also not up to safety standards, and that this was essentially an accident that was waiting to happen. And when they were bringing this to management, that management was threatening them with retaliation. So there are workers who wanted to make sure that the public was knowing what the risks of these businesses operating within their communities were, and their voices were silenced. And then we have a train derailment that caused and is still causing harm on the environment and people's health. So people, one of the things that people and I should hope would understand, is that workers not only want to make more money or have their own self-interest, there is also a good amount of making sure that their businesses are operating with integrity, and workers need help protecting themselves when they're trying to advocate for that. So areas with less engagement, this is a big one, is that we see a lot of areas that don't have higher union concentration. They have less stability, that they have the lower wages, which then in turn makes their government revenue lower. So their social programs aren't as good. Their schools aren't as good. We see a lot of various different places within the United States where you'll see a company that will come in, and we call them company towns. You'll have a company that will come in, they'll get very large tax breaks to bring a company in, and then an entire small economy is built around the company. You've got family members who are, entire families who are employed, and everybody works at the company. And then the company will essentially pull the rug, either to outsource or to, if they replace jobs with, if they replace workers with technological advances, which is a very real threat right now. Then in an entire city's economy pays for that. They might pay for that little by little over a longer period of time with less tax revenue, and again, lower quality schools and lower quality social programs. And so it's why it's really important for people within communities to use discernment and to make sure that they are not just working in their own self-interest, but they're also protecting their entire community from businesses. And we're seeing a lot of this with data centers right now, is that these data centers are not creating a lot of jobs, but they're not really enriching communities. They're taking a lot of resources, they're creating a lot more problems, but a lot of people don't have control over whether these data centers are going into their communities. And so that's a big thing that the Pope and a lot of prominent Catholics have been talking about, is that we really need to be on guard when these things are happening within our communities. So if you want to go to the next slide. Again, why is all of this so relevant now? It has been relevant for a long time, but I think that at this point in time, I had a meeting with a senator that we will be discussing this more when it comes to legislation. And again, economics, politics, a lot of people see these as things that are outside of what affects their everyday life. That history doesn't affect their everyday life, that economics and that politics don't affect their everyday life, when in reality, all of these things are either teaching us kind of what's to come, or the ways that things can happen. And politics and economics it touch every single part of our life. So why is it so relevant now? One of the things that a lot of legislators are talking about, and a lot of people who are within, higher up in Catholic organizations or other religious organizations, especially in charitable organizations, are talking about is that we are moving into what's called a deregulatory administration. And that's where a lot of regulation that is meant to protect the general public is being dismantled. And to be fair, a lot of these regulatory agencies have been slowly kind of hijacked by wealthier companies or wealthier business people who were able to influence policy and how that was written. So they were able to influence how policy was written to benefit them at the expense of either the workforce or smaller businesses. So this has been kind of a slow burn, but when we get into like a fully blown deregulatory environment, it's where a lot of people have to start learning how to kind of advocate for themselves and how to be politicians for themselves, and they need to be more politically literate and understand that now without those regulatory agencies, whether their policies are being scrapped or whether their funding is being scrapped or whether they're on the receiving end of a lot of firings, and so they're not working properly, that now that burden gets pushed onto the public. And for us to assume that it's not going to affect us is going to take a lot of people by surprise. So this is what a lot of politicians are really starting to warn about. So the realistically, that honestly, the lack of regulation that we are on the verge and on the precipice of, that is something that I kind of can't stress enough. And I talk about this to people when it comes to my own personal life is I work in the horse industry, and I've been in the horse industry for about a decade. And the horse industry is very, like, we don't have a lot of regulation. We don't have a lot of worker protections, which is why it is a very it's a very migrant heavy industry. And we, the horse industry as a whole, even though it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, the wages are exploitive, and it's not just two-legged workers like myself or like immigrants. It's also four-legged workers like horses. But it's also an industry where we are the sport that has the highest amount of traumatic brain injuries. So we have a good amount of accidents, which could be preventable with a better regulation. We also have a good amount of horses that end up being waste of the industry. And so they go into kill pens or they go into slaughter, which there is a bill that is, I think it's the third time that the bill is being proposed. And it is to end the export of horses for slaughter, which is the only way that horses can go to slaughterhouses right now. But one of the things that this bill is neglecting is what is going to happen to all of these horses after they just decide, okay, we're going to end horse slaughter by not allowing horses to leave the United States to go to Mexico or Canada. But we are not prepared for the 20,000 or 30,000 horses a year that go to slaughter. And so now we're just going to have this buildup of horses that there's nobody to care for when we already have overcrowded kill pens. So the horse industry has a lot of accidents. It's got a lot of injuries. It's got a lot of suffering when it comes to animals and when it comes to the workers. And that is the reality of a lack of protective legislation. So I think this is really, really relevant for a lot of Catholics to really start educating themselves on what Catholic social teachings in economics looks like and start to see their own experiences and their own opinions and start to think that things that may have happened to them, whether it is bad business practices, whether it is labor violations, start connecting the dots and creating community with people and understanding that it's not this rugged individualism that we've always thought it to be, that we have an opportunity to create community by solving very real economic problems. So, um, the other thing is, again, creating community. We are in a loneliness epidemic. A lot of the conflict that is happening within the United States and again globally is because we have separated ourselves economically from people, and especially in the workplace. People work 40 hours a week with individuals within their workplaces. And a lot of times you'll hear people say, they're your coworkers, they're not your friends, don't trust them. But that is a good portion of time that people are spending with other people, and it's important for us to learn how to actually create meaningful community. So engaging in very meaningful discussions and being able to say we have shared issues, shared problems, shared concerns. How can we work together to fix these? Because ultimately at the end of the day, in a time period of great wealth inequality where half of the workers are not able to obtain a living wage, and a time where our politics are dysfunctional, it's going to be on us to actually be able to figure out how to pick all of this stuff up and sort it out and solve the problems together and on our own. If you want to go to the next slide. Oh, I don't know what happened there. That's a really good that's on me. So the reflection is, how can we as Catholics lead the way in economic justice in our everyday lives as workers, as managers, as business owners, and as consumers? And this is a unique opportunity that we had, and some Catholics really took advantage of that opportunity to bring the gospel to life during the Great Depression and during the Polish Solidarity movement. Is that we have these times to be able to inspire people by leading the way, by getting in the trenches and rolling up our sleeves and doing a lot of the hard work ourselves, by educating ourselves, by humbling ourselves, and by figuring out how to help as many people as possible in a way that makes people look at how we exist in this world and think to themselves that that is who I thought that Jesus was, right? It's we've heard about this a lot. We've heard about a lot of people talking about losing faith in Christianity because the loudest representatives of Christianity have for a very long time very much yelled the walk, and the loudest voices are not, for some reason they're not given the ability, and they're not coming to the front of the stage and being prophetic enough to be able to say, no, we're going to really, really, really walk the walk. And so that is for me, it feels like a unique opportunity for us to be able to actually lead the way, to roll up our sleeves, to start creating community, to start doing really hard work and making people believe that we really mean what it is that we say. And then just an ending quote from Pope Leo XIV is, the earth will rest, justice will prevail, the poor will rejoice, and peace will return once we no longer act as predators, but as pilgrims, no longer each of us for ourselves, but walking alongside one another. So, and I had talked about this before, but this is one that I refer to a lot of the time as the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Catholic Church. This was Pope St. John Paul II. Before he passed away, he had a group that I believe has been disbanded, but was for Catholic social justice. And this is a good amount of economic policies, and it really breaks down the biblical reasoning behind the way that they guide Catholics to try and exist in this world. So this doesn't tell people exactly what to do. It just encourages you on where the gospel would land, where the gospel should guide you in what today looks like in the economy. So that's it.
Oh, thank you so much. That
Thank
was
you.
really great, Erin. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. I don't know if we're still recording, but
Yeah, yeah, we
yeah.
are, we are.
Yeah, I thought I had been okay. So I don't know whether it's just like me trying to organize my words and getting flustered after, um, I had I think I've told you personally, but I had a couple brain surgeries in 2020. And so sometimes my speech has a tendency to play some really fun jokes on me.
I I thought you were very clear in your presentation, but I know I certainly have some comments. But are there any questions from Aaron's presentation or any comments?
No questions for me. It was just very enlightening. This is actually the first meeting I've done with you, Jillian, so I appreciate this.
Yes, I'm so glad you're on here.
Thank you
I
so
just
much.
want to I just want to affirm what Jill said. I again, just like the first presentation, it was very interesting, very informative, and I appreciate the kind of delving into some of the parts and getting to a little bit of the nuance and the why behind some of the things and some of the context of it. I think that's really an important reminder for people that the documents that come out of the church all were written within a certain context and for a certain reason. It wasn't just because the Pope had a passion for it. It was because there was something going on that required it. And so to delve into that and understand it gives it more meat, more importance, because we can see why the church is wrestling this and how it connects to our faith and why it was important for our why it's important for our faith then and now to take a stand on this and to be clear on where how this connects to our faith. So you did a great job on that. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I really nerd out on I love the history of it and finding the historical parallels. And I mean, as Catholics, I know a lot of different religions see the way that we view saints as, kind of off-putting, but for us, saints are us looking at historical people that were just average everyday people that managed to figure out how to be prophetic in their time. And so I think that this history and like you said, these documents are kind of that same, they give me kind of that same inspiration. Yeah.
And to kind of tie in some things that stuck with me, I loved hearing about like those actual examples and stories that you had. Although because I didn't study them, it's hard for me to keep all of them in my head. But like almost as a broad note, from the very beginning, talking about our history as Catholic is as, we're immigrants too. And so we were very much these victims of, exploitation, or at least our ancestors were very much victims of exploitation and other things. And so it was really great to hear you, kind of touch on that is that, I think a lot of Catholics now are comfortable where they are. Many are not, but some are. But sometimes we forget that history. And we're also just today, there's a national group that's doing a book study. So other people in Catholic Social Action, Respect Life positions like me and Andrew around the country have been doing a little book study on Rerum Novarum, which has been fantastic. And so being able to recall, what was written then and what you said has, we didn't fulfill type of thing. Like the dreams of Rerum Novarum, we did not, care for the poor. We did not, the criticisms of communism and socialism, like we didn't address why those came about because of the suffering of the poor. Um, and it all very much just stems to the dignity of the human person. All people have dignity. It doesn't matter where you come from or what social class you are, but all of us have dignity. And so just being able to hear all the stories and examples that you had, Aaron, I think, really puts it into context for us.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of, I tell people, I love learning about history, kind of hate living through it a little bit. So it feels yeah, it feels that same way where, and again, as Catholics, I feel like it just gives us this unique opportunity to go take a beat. We've been here before, like we've been here before. And so we can use these examples to say, let's sit down and try to find a better way before things get, because historically when we've been here before, it usually gets worse before. And so I think that we kind of have, again, during Lent, that opportunity for the self-reflection, that opportunity for us to be able to say, like, when it comes to economics, how are we, are we living more like the religious hypocrites that Jesus condemned and that Jesus criticized? Do we have an opportunity to find redemption and turn that around? Do we have that opportunity to, change like our own hearts and change other people's hearts? And that to me, I don't know, there's a part of me that loves movies enough to be able to think it's possible.
Mhm. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. Thank you so much, Erin, for the wonderful presentation.
Very much, guys.
Thank you.